Hey everybody, my name is Isaac Smith. In this video I wanted to walk you guys through the process that I used to put together a 60 size airframe or 60-inch size airframe specifically from AJ Aircraft. This video is me showing kind of the process I use. By no means is this the best way to do it or the only way to do it, but I just wanted to get on here and make a video of the process that I use to put these planes together, and hope that it helps some of you guys. If you have any ideas or any feedback, things you do, I'm always open to hearing new ideas, new thoughts on putting these planes together. They're not too hard to put together, but there are a few tips and tricks that can help you out and make a big difference in the flight characteristics and the performance of the plane once it's put together. So the kit is behind me on my desk. I'll go ahead and walk you through kind of what came in the kit, and then we'll get right into putting it together. Here's the wing. It looks really, really nice. Really nice paint scheme with the AJ logo on here. I really like the gray, red, and black. Flip it over, we can see the bottom side of the wing. Nice contrast with the black on the bottom. And then you can see we have our side force generator with the two-tone red and black. Nice touch there. Alright, so I'm recording this clip after building the plane. Let's see, it's right here, all the way built. But I wanted to kind of walk through everything that I end up using in this video for the build. I think I've captured pretty much everything here. I know I'm missing some sandpaper, so I also use sandpaper, and that's not on the table here. But I'm going to just quickly walk through everything that I use in this build video. So starting over here, I have a Loctite, blue Loctite stick. Then I have an assortment of hex screwdrivers, got an assortment of cable ties, airplane stand, some industrial strength Velcro, screwdriver assortments, some vice grips, wire cutters, an assortment of small wrenches, assortment of pliers. This is a little Dremel tool. This is not 100% necessary. You can use a knife for this. I just end up using this to cut out the rudder servo hole, but really a knife kind of works better for that. Assortment of wrenches. This is 30-minute epoxy. I've got some little pins, some clear fingernail polish, masking tape, a lighter, different assortment of hobby knives, some scissors, a couple different hemostats. Really like this long kind of hemostat set. This works really well for some stuff that's harder to reach. I've got some double-sided 3M tape. I've got thin and medium CA with some accelerator. And I think that's pretty much it. There's a few other things that I may end up adding during the video, but this is the main stuff that you need to get this done. One of the first things I typically do when I'm putting together one of these airframes would be that I would go over all of the seams where the wood fits together, and I would go over it with some thin CA just to help keep the airframe strong, keep it lasting long, and make sure everything holds together through any kind of aggressive 3D maneuvers and just wear and tear over time. You don't have to put a whole lot of glue on there. I just like to put, just enough to where I see it soaking into the wood, but I don't want to add an excessive amount of glue. The next thing I would do would be to look over the covering on the plane and make sure to find any imperfections that need to be fixed. I'm talking about an edge that's peeling up or a wrinkle. Um, For right now, all that I found on the fuselage was this little edge right here was peeling up. So I went ahead and pre-warmed my iron to 220 degrees. This is a digital covering iron that I got on Amazon. You can look these up on Amazon and find them. Um, I set it to 220. It's currently at 255. When it's warming up, it kind of goes past the heat setting, and then you have to wait for it to cool back down a little bit to the setting that you set it at. So currently waiting on it to cool back down a little bit. I want it to be around 220 because I'm not trying to shrink the covering at all. I'm just trying to tack it down. I'll pop up a graphic on the screen that shows the different temperatures for Ultracoat. So there's a different temperature for just tacking it down, and then there's another temperature for, I believe it's around 300 degrees for when you want to start actually shrinking the Ultracoat. But if you just have a little edge peeling up right here, you just need to put it around 220 degrees, and you should be just fine to go ahead and tack that down. All right, so I got that edge tacked down. The next step I like to do is go over all the edges, like this and these edges where the Ultracoat has a hard, sharp corner, and go over that with a fine tip paintbrush and some clear fingernail polish. So I'm going to do that on the fuselage, and I'm also going to do that on the wing and the elevator and rudder. I am going to go ahead and look over the wing, elevator, and rudder for any edges that need to be tacked down with the iron first, and then I'm going to hit all of those edges with the clear fingernail polish. All right, so I'm about to go over this whole wing with some clear fingernail polish on all of the corners or edges. Ultracoat just to help tack those down. Don't need a lot. You don't want to glob it on. You don't want it to be super obvious. You do want enough on there to just kind of tack it down a little bit. Hopefully encourage it not to come off in flight. And you can kind of feel on the Ultracoat what the layers are. So for example, on this edge right here, it doesn't need any fingernail polish put right here because the white is on top of the red. So this red part right here is not going to peel off. If I come right here to the black corner, same thing there. The red is on top of the black, so this black is not going to peel off. But for example, right here, this gray corner, that could peel off. So just going to put a little dab of clear fingernail polish right there. I do like keeping my iron warm during this process in case, like in this example right here, I run across a edge that needs to be laid back down before putting the fingernail polish on there. Okay, so now that I'm done with this wing, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the process on the elevator, rudder, other wing, and the fuselage. The next step I'm going to be doing will be putting the control horns in the different control surfaces. So to start with, I'm going to do the rudder. I've chosen to use the pull-pull system on this plane for the rudder. It does come with hardware to do a typical pushrod system, but I like doing the pull-pull system largely because it puts a servo forward in the fuselage, and that helps make sure that your plane is not too tail heavy and you don't have to add any weight to the nose uh, to compensate for that. I have brought the fuselage over here just to kind of show what I'm talking about there. So if I get this in camera view, if you look in the fuselage here, you can see that there's a spot for the servo, for the rudder servo right here where the cables for the pull system come. And then another important note to make is that on the tail here, you can see the wires for the pull system come above the elevator. The option for a push rod for the rudder would have a servo down here. I'm not exactly sure which side. Okay, so you can see on this side, the elevator hole is already cut for the elevator servo. So there's an option to put a rudder servo. I'm just feeling right here. You can kind of see that indent. That's where your rudder servo would go if you used the pushrod system for the rudder. But I'm going to use the pull system, but that's just important to note because that will determine the placement of our control horn. So if we look at the rudder, there are two different spots where a control horn can go. I can feel there's a block of wood in the rudder right here. That would be the spot for your pushrod system. And then there's another block of wood right here. That's where your control horn is going to go for the pull system. So this is the control horn, like I said, for the pull system. And then the one for the pushrod system also comes in your hardware kit, but I won't be using that for this build. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you need to find the pre-cut slot in this block of wood for where the control horn is going to go. The best way I've kind of found to do it is just kind of feeling around, feeling where there's a groove. I found right under this seam in the Ultracoat right here, I can feel kind of a groove, and if I take the control horn, I can kind of push in and figure out where that groove is going to be. You want to be gentle here because you don't want to be indenting the wood in the wrong spot, um, thinking that you found the slot when you haven't, but I think the slot is right around there. So I'm going to go ahead and get a hobby knife and cut that slot out. Another key here that you found the right spot, when you go to cut, it should be nice and smooth. I didn't have any resistance cutting that slot with this knife because I'm not cutting into any wood because this is a pre-cut slot. Flipping it over, I'm going to repeat that process. Just go find that groove. Just using the control horn to kind of make an indent so I can see it. Then just take this knife, cut that slot out. Now I can test fit the control horn in there. And goes in pretty easily. I'm just kind of working it just to kind of loosen up that hole just a little bit. Don't want to force it too hard. You do have to apply some pressure to get it to go in. There we go. All right, so we can see now I've got the control horn in. I don't like that there's some covering kind of pulled up on the edges there, so I'm going to take my hobby knife and clean that up. It's important to have a very sharp hobby knife for this. This knife is brand new. You want to make sure your knife is sharp so it cuts through the Ultracoat very cleanly. All right, so I got the edges of the Ultracoat around the control horn cleaned up. So the kit comes with this alignment tool that I have slid on here. I just used some of the screws that came in the hardware kit just to kind of hold it in place. But you can put this alignment tool on the control horn to hold it in place while the glue dries after you glue it in. So now that I've prepped the rudder surface for the control horn, I'm going to go ahead and do the same on the elevator and ailerons. One thing to note about the elevator is make sure that you are putting the control horn on the bottom of the elevator. On this plane, the control horn goes in the bottom left. So looking at it, if this is the left side and this is the bottom, the control horn goes right there. The slot is actually already pre-cut, so I didn't even have to cut the slot. I can just stick the control horn straight in there. All right, so there you go. The control horn just slid right into its already pre-cut slot. And as you can see on the fuselage, it makes sense that it's on the bottom left because the hole for the servo is also right there on the bottom left. Similar to the elevator, the slots in the Ultracoat for the wings are already pre-cut, so it's as simple as just sliding the control horn in there for the wing. Before you start gluing in the control horns, you want to take each of the control horns and rough them up with some pretty heavy grit sandpaper. This just will help the glue to stick better. You only need to rough up this bottom part where the glue is going to be touching. Alright, so that's pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat the process on the other control horns. I like to then take a wet paper towel and just wipe off where just sanded, just to kind of get any of the remaining grit from sanding off the control horn, just so that I'm not gluing to grit. I would want to be gluing straight onto the surface that's just been roughed up. Next step is very important. You want to go ahead and take some masking tape and tape off around the hole in your control surfaces to make sure that when you glue, no glue gets actually on the control surface itself. Alright, so here's the rudder all taped off and ready to go. Now we just need to repeat that same process on the elevator and ailerons. To glue in these control horns, I recommend using some 15 or 30-minute epoxy. I'm going to be using 30-minute epoxy just because I want to have plenty of time to put the control horns in each of these control surfaces, and I only want to mix up one batch of epoxy to cover all of these different control surfaces. So I've got a piece of cardboard that I'm going to use for a pad to mix up the epoxy on, and then I'm just going to use the back end of this paintbrush to mix up the epoxy, and then I will start gluing in these control horns. So for this epoxy, you just want to lay down a bead of glue, putting a pretty generous amount just because I don't know exactly how much I will need. And then you take the hardener and do your best to just put the exact same amount of hardener down. Okay, so that's pretty thoroughly mixed. So now I'm going to put some glue straight on the control horn that is going to go into the rudder. So I'm just going to apply a very generous amount. I'm not too worried about putting too much glue on here because that's why I've got the masking tape on the rudder to prevent any glue from getting on the rudder. I don't want to put so much on that it's just dripping off, but I also don't want to skimp out at all on the glue because we want to make sure we have a plenty of glue. All right, so there's, I don't know how well the camera's picking it up, but there's the control horn with glue all over it. I'm just going to go ahead, push this in. You know what? I am going to put some gloves on for this just to make sure I don't get glue on my hands and then end up getting glue on the plane itself. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and push it through. And the reason I went ahead and test fit all of these control horns ahead of time was so that I didn't have to fight to get it on right now. So you can see quite a bit of glue has squeezed out from when I pushed that control horn in. And just take a paper towel and wipe that right off. Alright, so now that I got some of that excess glue on, I'm actually going to work it back and forth a little bit just to make sure that glue has soaked all the way in through to the other side. Now I'm going to do my best to kind of force any glue into the gaps on each side. Just making sure I get as much glue down in that hole as I possibly can. Trying to hold on to the rudder here where I've got this tape just in case I got glue on these gloves. I can avoid getting it on the rudder as much as possible. If you do end up getting some glue on your control surface, some acetone should take it off, but it's definitely best to try to avoid that. Alright, now I'm just eyeballing it. I'm just trying to get it as close as I possibly can to where I need to be, just so I can go ahead and get everything all nice and cleaned up. Okay, so the kit comes with an alignment tool that I'm now going to use to go ahead and hold this this control horn in place while it dries. So this is the alignment tool, and the way this works, you just put it right here and then you run a screw or something through those holes into the holes on the control horn to hold it in place. So I just am using the screws, some of the hardware screws that came in the kit, and I'm just going to go ahead and just push those through. And then it's important to kind of look down from the top and make sure that you have an equal amount of the control horn sticking out on both sides of the rudder. You don't want more control horn on one side versus the other. Pretty happy with that. So now I'm just going to set that aside and let it dry. Alright, so moving on to the elevator, it's much simpler. All you got to do is put glue on the control horn and just pop it in. Not too complicated, and that'll be the same process for the elevator and the ailerons. So let me go ahead and bring my glue back over here. And put a generous amount on that control horn. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and also put some right here as well, just so that when I push the control horn in there, it kind of pushes some glue in. You want to make sure you push it all the way down to where you feel the control horn seat into its slot in the control surface. And then once again, take a paper towel or something to wipe away all that excess glue, just because you don't want that glue dripping on your covering later as it's drying. So that's pretty much all there is to it. I will say it is important to double check and make sure that the hole in your control horn is perfectly centered above the bevel and the control surface. So as you can see right here, the hole in the control horn, if I can get it to focus on there, is exactly centered on the bevel that's going all the way through here. But if it was off-centered, you just would want to make sure that when it's drying centered on there so that it doesn't mess with the geometry um, of the push rod and of the control horn. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat that same process on the ailerons, and then I'll be done with installing the control horns. Alright, so this is a little while later, and the glue on all the control horns has dried now. But I wanted to show you that when I went to pull the masking tape off from around the control horns, some of the masking tape still stayed on there. As you can see right here, we still have some of the tape hanging out around the control horn. And what I have found, if that happens, if you have a pair of tweezers, especially like little needle nose tweezers like these, using these tweezers and having some patience, you can kind of get up under that masking tape and you can peel it up. You just have to be very careful to not cut into the covering at all with those needle nose tweezers. You can also take a hobby knife and kind of come over the tape like this a little bit and try to cut it. Like I said, just being careful not to cut into the covering. If you're going to cut, make sure you're cutting towards the control horn so that if you're resting the knife on something, it's resting on the control horn, not on the surface. So I ran into a situation where taking the masking tape off did cut the covering a little bit, unfortunately. So I'm going to take some clear fingernail polish and go back over this spot just to make sure that we're tacking down that covering real good so that it doesn't peel up in the future. Next step I want to do is go ahead and test fit the wings on the plane, because I want to, well, actually the next step is going to be installing the elevator, but I want to be able to have the wings on there so that I can measure from the wing tips of the wings to the elevator to make sure that it's centered from wingtip to elevator on both sides. But it's actually pretty normal for these planes for the wing tube to need to be sanded down just a little bit because of how tight the fit is on the wings. So I'm going to go ahead and test fit and see how tight it is. So yeah, I can't get the wing tube past right there in this wing without doing a little bit of sanding. So I just have a cloth right here to um, catch any dust coming off of this carbon fiber. I'm going to go ahead and sand it a little bit. So it's important not to breathe in this carbon fiber dust. I also want to try to catch it to not make a mess. That's why I've got this rag here and I'm wearing gloves to not get it all over my hands. Rag right here just to wipe off carbon fiber tube afterwards to try to get all those shavings off. Just try to keep from making a mess on the plane. Let's test fit again. Okay, it's a little looser, but it's still very tight. Need to do a little bit more sanding. Alright, there we go. Tube fits on this wing. Definitely made a mess, you can see. Got on me, got on the floor, even with me trying to keep from making a mess. This stuff is really messy. So now that I know that I can put the wings on and that the carbon fiber tube is not too tight, I'm going to go ahead and take the wings off and get the elevator prepped to be glued into the plane. First thing I would do before trying to glue the elevator into the fuselage would be to take these little cables for the pull system on the rudder and just untape them, because the tape is so close to where the elevator is that you are liable to accidentally hit the edge of that tape with some of the glue from the elevator. So I'd just go ahead and peel that up and then just tape it back up just a little bit higher on both sides. Then after that, you can go ahead and take your elevator and test fit it into the pre-cut slot. I really like how well this elevator sits into this slot. It's basically like a puzzle piece. It just slides in perfectly. It's locked in really well. I'm going to go ahead and get some tape and tape the elevator to the horizontal stabilizer just to keep it from flopping around so much, and so that it can be easier to see and confirm that it's at a perfect 90-degree angle. Okay, so looking at it from the back, we can see that it's basically a perfect 90-degree angle just from fitting it in the slot. But it's a good idea to go ahead and take a measuring tape and just measure from the tip of the vertical stabilizer to the tip of the elevator and just confirm that that measurement is the same. I'm getting right at 15 3/4 inches. Getting the same thing on this side. So that tells me it's pretty close, but the true measurement and test will be once we get glue on the elevator. We're going to go ahead and put the wings on and measure from the wing tips to the elevator tips. For glue, I'm going to once again use this 30-minute epoxy. It's a good idea to go ahead and have some acetone on standby in case you get a little bit of glue on a covering or something like that. With some acetone and a paper towel, you can wipe it off pretty easily. So With that said, I'm going to go ahead and mix up the epoxy, and then as far as where to place the glue, it's important to make sure you get a lot of glue on the wood piece right here, because that's what's going to be bonding to the piece of wood on the fuselage itself in this slot in here. And I will go ahead and put some glue on the covering and on the insides and on some of the covering on the back, but it's not as critical to get a lot of glue on covering, because covering is, it can pull off, and the strongest bond is going to be on the wood to wood surface. That's going to be right here. Alright, so I'm going to start by applying glue in the fuselage itself. So after looking at this, I don't think it's going to be necessary to put glue on the covering on the elevator, just on the wood piece, because there's plenty of glue on the spots on the fuselage that will be touching those spots on the elevator that are covering, and we already know those are not as critical to get glue on a strong glue hold as it is on this wood piece. So I will be adding some glue to this piece of wood right here on the elevator. Alright, the elevator's in there. It's got glue on it. I'm going to go back over and wipe all this excess glue off. Reason we put 30-minute epoxy on here, so that we can have plenty of time to get everything situated and adjusted properly before the glue starts to set up. Okay, the glue has been applied. I'm going to go ahead and move the plane to the floor so I can go ahead and check the alignment of everything. Okay, I have the wings on and I've taped the aileron so that they won't flap around. Now I'm going to measure from the tip of the aileron to the tip of the elevator. So the trailing edge, tip of the aileron to leading edge tip of the elevator. Here is 31.5 inches. Check the other side. And it's now a little bit less. We're going to just barely slide it back towards that direction. Measure again, and you just keep doing this until you've got the elevator in a position where both measurements are exactly the same. Okay, so I think I've got it perfect. I did find measuring from the trailing edge tip of the wing and the trailing edge tip of the elevator is easier than trying to measure from the leading edge of the elevator to the trailing edge of the wing. So that's a little tip for you. Now that I've done that measurement, I'm going to just reconfirm this measurement to make sure that the elevator is sitting right at a 90-degree angle. So we're right around 16 inches there. Yep, that's perfect. Alright, so now I'm just going to make sure to not bump the elevator, to leave that alone until it is fully tacked up. Okay, so the next part that I am going to do will be gluing on the rudder with the CA hinges that come with it. They're already pre-glued into the rudder, so all you have to do is glue the rudder into the vertical stabilizer on the fuselage, and you're good to go there. I did trim a little bit of the covering. It was on the rudder right here. It had kind of covered up some of the CA hinge, so I just wanted to make sure I could uh, cleanly glue onto that CA hinge when I slid it into the slot here. But I've already pre-test fitted in the slots, but you got to do that first before you would cut any covering, just to make sure you can see the CA hinges good. These slots and the vertical stabilizer already come pre-cut, so it's pretty easy to just slide it in. Line up the bottom of the rudder with the bottom of the fuselage right here, so that when you put your tail wheel on later, it's all flush right here. And then go ahead and just make sure you push firmly against the rudder to make sure it's snugged up against the fuselage. I have my elevator taped at full deflection so that it's not blocking me moving the rudder at all. And I'm going to go ahead and just move the rudder to full deflection. And then I will go ahead and just kind of snug it up with my thumb right here, make sure I have as small of a gap as possible right here when I glue this. Now I'm going to take some of my thin CA and I'm going to just put just a drop or two on both halves of the CA hinge. It's very important not to overdo the glue because it will drip through to the other side of the plane and make a big mess. You want to make sure that that CA hinge is soaking up all your glue. You should see it just kind of soak into that hinge. Now remember, half of this hinge already has been glued, so you know that hinge's capacity to soak up glue has already been, it's already got some glue in there from the other half of the hinge being glued into the rudder. Alright, so I just did those two. I'm just going to hold here for a second and let that glue set up for a minute. And then I'm going to come down here, make sure I hold it firm right there. We've done this many times and used too much glue and accidentally got glue in the hinge or all over the covering or something like that. So it's important to not overdo it. You don't want to underdo it also, because you want to make sure your hinges are secure. I would go ahead and just do it like that. And then we'll flip it over and just make sure it looks like we didn't get any glue coming through on the other side. Make sure it's still in camera frame here. Alright, it's looking really good on this side. I'm going to come through and just put a very, very tiny little bit on this side. Alright, and there you go. Doesn't take a lot of glue. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. Next, I want to talk about installing the aileron servos. I've chosen to go with the Theta 988s. The reason there's not a plug on the end of this servo is because I like making my own servo extensions. So I just cut the wires off of the servo, added this wire, and then when I run it through the wing, I will just make the extension the length I want it to be. So that's not a necessary step, but I just thought I'd mention that in case you're curious as to why there's not a plug on the end of this servo right now. I'm going to add it later. So this wing comes with a thread already taped inside the wing right here, so that you can easily just run your wire through the wing using that thread. So I'm going to go ahead and just tape my wire on here with some masking tape and pull it through. And there we go. Alright, so for this servo I didn't have to do any cutting to fit it into this slot. It just sat right in here perfectly. And they're already pre-drilled holes for the servo to mount into. So what I like to do is go ahead and get my mounting screws and go ahead and screw them in part of the way, just to make sure that the holes are in the right spot. Just make sure that the servo's seated in there correctly. Make sure when you're putting it in there that it's not binding on anything, that's fully seating down in its slot. And then I would not just crank down on one of these screws, because if you lift up the servo and just kind of start the screw, you can see exactly where the hole is that you're going into. It's also important not to over tighten these screws, because you're not screwing it into a nut or anything, you're just screwing straight into a piece of wood, so you can strip that wood out. So I'm just going to go ahead and get all these screws started. Alright, now that I've already screwed the screws in and unscrewed them, those holes are tapped, they're opened up to the size they need to be. Now I'm going to come back and hit each of the holes with a couple drops of thin CA, just to make sure that the holes are going to be strong, that the wood's not going to split in the future or anything like that. It's just a good idea to do this to add a little bit of strength. Don't want to overdo it too much with the CA, just because you don't want the glue to drip through the hole onto the other side of the wing. A little bit should do. And now what I'm not trying to do is glue the screws into the hole, because if you end up screwing the screws back into the hole before the glue dries, it'll glue that screw in there and it'll really mess up the wood if you ever have to come back and unscrew the screws to replace the servos or anything. So I'm going to go ahead and let the glue dry before I go back to putting the servo in. I have some CA kicker. I'll go ahead and kick the CA just with a very small bit, but it's not necessary to do that. You can just also wait for the glue to dry. All right, there we go. Servo is nice and snug. Go ahead and repeat the same process on the other wing. The next thing I'll be doing is installing the elevator servo on the fuselage. The elevator servo goes into this hole that is on the left side of the fuselage. Make sure you're putting it in the correct hole. There is a hole on the other side of the fuselage. It does not come already opened up. It actually comes closed up, and that's the hole if you wanted to uh, put a pushrod on the rudder. So if the hole on the other side of the fuselage that comes covered, you could open that hole for the rudder servo if you wanted to use the pushrod system, but I'm going to be using the pull system, so I'm not going to touch that hole. So for the elevator servo, we're going to make sure that we have the arm on the servo towards the back of the plane. So it's already set up correctly here, where I have the arm on the back side of the servo. It would be backwards if I did it that way. So like this, that way the push rod, when we go to put the push rod on, it can reach. It'll be too short if you turn the servo around the other way. So I'm going to go ahead and work the servo in here. For these Theta servos, I did not have to trim at all. It fit in there perfectly, but if you did have to trim, you could get a hobby knife or something and carefully cut away some of the wood if you have a little bit bigger servo. But this slot is perfect for these servos. Now I'm going to take something pointy. I've got these little needle nose tweezers. I'm just going to use that just to kind of mark a hole, poke a little hole where I need to drill the screw holes for the servo. So I'm holding the servo still with my thumb. I'm just going to poke a little hole in each of these. 4 spots. Now I'm going to pull my rudder servo back out. I can see my 4 marks. I'm going to go ahead and drill a hole in there. After looking at the size of these screws for the servos, they're very tiny screws, and I decided not to pre-drill holes, but instead to poke holes with these little pointy end needle nose tweezers, just because I am concerned that if I drill a hole with a drill bit, that I'm going to get a hole too big. The smallest drill bit size I have is a 1/16, and that's not much smaller than those screws. So just kind of poke some little holes here. Um, don't be aggressive with it. You just need some small holes. The whole reason we're doing this is just so that when I go to screw these screws into the wood, I don't want to split the wood, and then you're liable to do that if you don't pre-drill or pre-poke any holes. But I would recommend just getting something and poking a little hole instead of using a drill bit, unless you have a really tiny drill bit. So now that I got those holes pre-poked, go ahead and taking the servo back out now that I've pre-tapped all the holes with the screws. Just like I did with the Aileron servos, I'm going to put a couple drops of Thin Sea on each of the servo holes. Now I'm going to wait for that to dry, and I'll go ahead and install the elevator servo. Okay, now that the glue has dried, I'm going to go ahead and install this servo. The next thing I'm going to do will be installing the rudder servo. So the tricky thing with this is that this servo is a little bit wider than the pre-cut slot here, so I'm going to have to cut a little bit of the wood just so I can fit this servo in here. It's a good idea to measure that out, because you don't want to cut the slot too big, but you also want to make sure it's big enough that you can fit the servo in there without having to force it in. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just get a Sharpie and draw a little line on this slot just to mark where I need to cut. Just kind of eyeballing right there. There. All right. There's my line that I'm going to cut on, and then in order to cut this, you could use a hobby knife. I'm going to use this little Dremel tool with a cutting bit, but a hobby knife or any kind of knife that's real sharp would work as well. I would just recommend, if you use a knife, just go slow. Alright, so after I cut it out with the Dremel tool, I went back with a knife and cleaned up the hole a little bit. The rotary tool cut it at an angle, so the hobby knife kind of cleaned up that angle. Now I'm going to see if it fits. Pull tight. There we go. And there we go. Now it fits. And just like on the elevator servo, I'm going to go ahead and mark my holes and go ahead and screw this servo in. Next, I'm going to mount the motor mount for the T-motor straight onto the front of the plane right here. The plane comes with these mounting screws, so it's as simple as just lining up the holes, putting the screws in, and you're good to go. I'm just using this 3mm Allen screwdriver to put the bolts in. It's very important that you put Loctite on these bolts, as these are what's holding the motor in. I really like this Loctite stick. You can get this from Amazon, but it's a lot cleaner than using traditional Loctite that makes a mess and drips everywhere. So with this, you can just scrape a little bit onto the end of your bolt like that, and you're good to go. Something else I like to do, I have these little lock nuts, and I like to put those on the back of the bolts just for added security, to make sure these bolts don't try to back out. Just because when you're doing crazy 3D maneuvers and pulling a lot of G's on this motor, it tends to try to wiggle those bolts out. So it's just an added layer of security holding these bolts in if you put some little lock nuts on the back. Now that I got the motor mount on there, I'm going to go ahead and slap the motor on and run the wires for the ESC, and we'll be done with the motor install. One thing I do want to mention is that even if you plan to use zip ties to mount your ESC to your plane, which you really should, Velcro is not going to be nearly strong enough for the ESC alone. But even if you are going to use zip ties, or when you do use zip ties, I still like putting some Velcro on the ESC and on the plane to mount it on, just because that Velcro adds some cushion, and I think could help some with some vibration dampening if there's any kind of vibrations or anything like that. So that's just something I like to do, is just, even though I'm going to come back and add zip ties to the ESC, I also like to use Velcro as well to hopefully aid in some vibration dampening there. One other thing I want to mention is that before you run your cable ties for your ESC mount, because they're going to come over this piece of wood right here, it's a good idea to go ahead and put your Velcro down for your flight battery, because if you run those cable ties now, you're going to be putting Velcro down on top of cable ties, which you don't want. So you want to go ahead and run your Velcro, if you plan to put Velcro all the way up in the nose, which I'm not exactly sure where my battery placement is going to be for the right CG. So if you're planning to run a strip all the way up through the nose, which is what I plan to do, just so that I can move the battery anywhere I want, it's a good idea to go ahead and do that before you put your zip ties on for your motor, or for your ESC, excuse me. One thing I will mention is this kit does come with some Velcro used for, or that's meant to be used for mounting the battery, and I'm choosing not to use that. I'm using some Velcro. Here, let me show you the box. This is what it looks like. Industrial strength, really strong Velcro that I got from Amazon. And the reason I use this instead of the stuff that comes in the kit, one is because that's the stuff that's on my batteries. So I like having the same Velcro on my batteries that I also have in the plane. And then also I found that this stuff that I'm using from Amazon is some of the stickiest and strongest Velcro that I have found. And sometimes the stuff that comes in these ARFs is not always super strong or super sticky. And this stuff is really, really sticky. And it's going to be really hard to get that off. So I just like using this stuff instead of what comes in the kit. But yeah, there you go. Alright, so I'm going to now move on to putting the push rods on. We're going to start with the elevator. I'm really just going to talk through, I think just talking through the elevator push rod installation will be enough. The installation of the push rods on the elevator and on the ailerons is pretty much the same. I will also talk through the rudder though, because the rudder is going to use a pull-pull cable system instead of using a push rod. So locate your push rod, and then you're going to have some ball joint linkages and some little Allen screws that are going to go on each end of the push rod. So the first thing you want to do is go ahead and just start screwing on the linkages. On these push rods, one of the sides, the threads are going the normal direction, and on the other side they're going the opposite way. So you want to just kind of start trying to screw it in, and like I'm screwing it in and I can feel it's not trying to grab, so I'm going to go, this would be counterclockwise, and now I feel the threads are grabbing. So in this side of this push rod, it's actually turning it left, is tightening it. So now that I got that one started, trying to stay in camera frame here. Now that I got that one started, I'm going to go ahead and move on to this one and get this started. Alright, so now that I have them started, I'm just going to rotate the ball joints in the same number of times on each side. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get to where about half of the threads are covered up by the ball joint on each side. And then I will start fine tuning for where it needs to be for the control horn and the push rod, control arm on the servo to line up so that I can just pop this in here and the elevator will be centered. So I'm just going to go ahead and start by rotating or screwing both of these on to where about halfway down on the threads. The best way I have found to do that, so because these ball joints are so tight, the threads are so tight, the best way I found to screw them on is to take a screwdriver or something that's small enough to put through the hole in the ball joint, and then you can grab this center section right here that's made for tightening. You can grab it with a pair of vice grips, or in this case I have a wrench that's the correct size. This is a 4mm wrench, so I'm just going to put that on there to hold it from spinning. Then I'm just going to hold that with this hand and then rotate on, and that starts tightening it. You don't want to try to go too fast here because you can end up messing up the plastic for the ball joint if you try to just crank down on it really fast. I'm going to do this one, the other side, go in the opposite direction. Now that I have the ball joints started on the push rod, I'm going to take a little piece of masking tape, tape it onto the counterbalance of the elevator and the elevator itself, just to hold it perfectly centered. And then I'm going to go ahead and power up my servo so that I can center my servo, so that I can now go ahead and fine tune the push rod to get it the perfect length to just fit perfectly on there. Alright, so now I have the servo plugged in, powered up. As you can see, it's connected to the transmitter. I have all the trims centered on the transmitter. Have the elevator taped so that it doesn't move. So now it's just a matter of fine tuning the adjustments on these ball links so that it'll fit perfectly, the push rod will fit perfectly on there. For the servo arms that I'm using, they only have one hole on them, so I'm forced to just put the push rod on the furthest out hole. But depending on what arms you're using, you may be able to get away with putting it on a hole that's closer to the servo. My recommendation would be to choose the hole that you're putting the push rod in on the servo based on a couple different factors. One would be your flying style. So if you're trying to get the most aggressive 3D maneuvers, you want super high rates, you want to get 55 degrees of throw on the elevator, you're going to want to have a pretty long servo arm. I think this one is, let me see, this is a 1.25 inch servo arm. And as you can see, if I move the servo a little bit, there's barely any clearance between the servo arm and the elevator, so this is really the longest arm you can get away with. But if you're trying to do more like scale flying and you don't need all that throw, then I would maybe just run the stock servo arms or run a modified servo arm, but put the pushrod on a hole that's a little closer into the servo. Because the further away you move your pushrod from the center of the servo, so the further out we get on the control arm, the resolution decreases as we move further away, because a smaller movement up here, we lose a lot of resolution when we're further away from the center of the servo, or from the point where the servo arm connects. So if you don't need all that throw, put your push rod a little closer, but if you want all the throw for 3D, go ahead and put it on the furthest out hole so you can make sure to get the max throw that you can out of the servo. So what I like to do to line up this push rod to make sure you've got your ball links adjusted the correct amount, go ahead and just put the screw in the end of that ball link on each end, and then just put it in one of the holes. So both of the holes, this, and then see if it will fit in the other one. So look at that, pretty much perfect here. I'm going to go ahead and screw this one in a little bit more. Yep, looks like basically perfect. So we're good to go ahead and just put these little bitty nuts on the back of these bolts, and we're good to go there. Another thing that I did not mention, because the control arms are already on these servos, depending on the type of control arm you have, there may be a screw on the side of the control arm. In this case, there is one right here. This is where the screw is. You do want to make sure that you've got that screw tightened to make sure the control arm is good and tight on the servo, because you don't want any play in that control arm. So that's the point of that screw, is to tighten that arm down, squeeze it in on the gear on the servo so that there's no play there. So the way I'm putting this nut on the back of this bolt, I have a, let's see what this is, a 4mm little wrench, and I've got the nut started. I'm going to go ahead and back this bolt out all the way until where the nut is touching on the back of the servo arm. Put this wrench on there, and then I'm going to tighten it back down. So now it's screwing the nut on as well as screwing this bolt into the servo arm. Now once I feel it stop, I can just snug on that nut. It's not necessary to put Loctite on these nuts because they are lock nuts, so they aren't going to back off. Go ahead and tighten that down, and repeat on the control horn on the elevator. Alright, now I'm going to remove the tape off the elevator here. Being careful when you do that, because it can try to pull up the covering sometimes. You zoom back out a little bit. There we go. Now give it a test. Yep. Plenty of throw there. And you can repeat this process for the aileron servos. Okay, so the next step I'm going to do will be putting the cowl on. So there's little nuts on the back and the 4 spots where the cowl mounts. There's little nuts on the back of the wood right here. So to start with, the method I like to do is I'll get a piece of tape, masking tape. I'm going to put it right over where the bolt will attach, making sure to leave enough extra right here so that I can use it to tape the cowl down later. Make sure that where you put the tape on, the fuselage is nice and flat, and that you've rubbed it down pretty well so that it's nice and stuck to the fuselage. And then I'll take a little pin, like a little safety pin like this. I'm going to find where that nut is. I'm just going to poke a hole through the covering and to the tape. Not sure if you can see that too well. Let me zoom in. Alright, so I poked the hole through the covering and through the tape. Then I'm going to kind of work the safety pin around just to fill that hole out to where it is the size of the hole that the nut, and work the safety pin around to where it fills out that hole. And now I have my mark on my tape of where I need to drill the hole in the cowl. So I'll go ahead and do that again. Do it for each of the mount locations for the cowl. Okay, so the next step is going to be pulling back tape just a little bit so that we can slide the cowl on. Alright. It's important to make sure that you have this canopy part on the fuselage when we're doing this. It could change the setting where all this is going to line up if that was not on there. Go ahead and try to get this canopy on, or sorry, cowl on. Make sure that it is on the bottom all the way around. Make sure it's on the top. Now we need to get our spinner and our prop. So one thing I do want to mention, and I'll have to pull the cowl off to show you this. This is unique to the T-motor. I'm not sure if there are any other motors that are like this, but the part that the prop seats on, this little piece right here, it can actually be scooted forward if you put these washers that come in with the T-motor. Put these washers on here, you can actually scoot this forward, which effectively pushes the prop forward. So when I'm doing the lining up for the cowl with this T-motor, I can pretty much just rest the cowl against the prop, or sorry, rest the cowl against the back plate of the spinner, and then I can come back later and I can put those spacers in on the prop mount on the motor to push it out a little bit. Okay, so now I have the prop and the spinner backing plate on. And the reason I have the prop on is just to hold that backing plate secure. So now I'm just going to line up cowl using the backing plate of this spinner as guideline. So when you're lining this up, there's multiple things you need to pay attention to. First of all, you need to pay attention to the front of the cowl. Make sure that it's not off to the right or left or up or down. So make sure it's perfectly centered with this spinner backing plate. The other thing you want to check for are the paint lines on the fuselage to make sure that your cowl isn't twisted. In this case, it's twisted just a little bit. Check the other side. Just get it as perfectly centered as you can. All right. So like I said, in my case, I'm not going to leave a gap because I'll just push the prop out with the spacers on that T motor later. But if you do not have that option when you're doing this, you would want to leave a little bit of a gap right here. So now what you want to do, you want to take the tape that you put on here earlier. You're going to tape cowl down with those pieces of tape. And now I would take a Sharpie. I've already done it on this hole, but I would take a Sharpie and find the little hole on the tape and draw over that hole. So you'll mark the cowl right where that hole is. And do that on each hole. Then take everything back apart. Alright, so now that I have the cowl back off, I don't know how well the camera will pick it up, but you can see Sharpie marked each of the spots on the cowl where I need to drill. Now that I have the holes marked, I'm going to use a 1/16 drill bit to go ahead and drill out these holes. This part can be a little tricky the first time. Put the cowl on, so taking off the canopy hatch off the fuselage can help. It allows you to pull the cowl away a little bit so you can kind of see what you're doing. Get those screws lined up. It's not a bad idea to go ahead and start the screws, at least both of the screws on the same side, so that you can look and see what you're working. After you get the cowl bolted down, I'll go ahead and test fit the canopy. Just make sure it fits. It's probably going to be pretty snug your first time. Go ahead and test fit that on, make sure it fits real good. And then I would go back for each of the cowl bolts. Assuming this is your last time to bolt the cowl on, I would go back and pull all the bolts out, add a little Loctite to them, and then put them back in, and you should be good to go. Before I add the cowl on for the final time, I did want to show kind of the wire management that I have done for running the wires from the motor to the ESC all the way up to the receiver. So just kind of taking some shots of that. Just a reminder, for whichever motor you're using, make sure that all the bolts that bolt the motor into any motor mounts, or in this case I have a fan, like just make sure that all those bolts that they have Loctite on them, there's going to be a lot of pressure put on these components as you're doing 3D maneuvers, and you want to make sure stuff doesn't rattle loose. As you can see, I've got some zip ties right here. They're zip tying this ESC onto the fuselage. A couple zip ties holding all the wires in place. You can see I'm running the power wire, the battery on the fuselage that way, and then there's actually two wires that come off of this ESC. One is your main signal wire and power wire. The other one is used for telemetry. The way that this T-motor ESC is set up, though, I'm not going to be using the telemetry, but that telemetry wire can also be a redundant power wire, just to make sure you have a backup power for your servos and stuff. So I just run that wire to an open channel on my receiver, which I'll show you here in a second. Okay, so from a top-down view here, you can see my battery wire coming up right here, and then I have those wires from the ESC. They're coming down under here. I've just got a couple zip ties securing them on, and then we have the throttle wire right here going into the throttle channel on my receiver, and then this signal wire, it's going into channel 5, which is not being used for anything, so that's just a redundant power. So I'll also show kind of how I've got my wire ran for elevator. In order to run it through those holes like I have here, I did have to run the wire and then add the plug after I ran it all the way up here. I think I talked about that earlier in the video, that I like to make my own extensions and add on my own plugs. So that's not necessary. You could have just run a servo extension, and then in that case, there's some little guides back in there, right above where that hole, where you see the wire going through that hole. There's a little guide there, and you can run the wire through that instead. Yeah, that comes up here, and then I have this little wire guide. You can buy these on AJ Aircraft, but I've got that wire guide right there, and then this comes all the way up in here, and then these extensions for the aileron servos are custom made, just some short little extensions to plug the ailerons in. Once I slide the wings on, there'll be the plug from the aileron servos will come in, and then it'll just plug right into those short little extensions. And yeah, that's the wire management I have going on. Oh, also I will mention for the rudder, as you can see, the rudder wire is extremely short. I cut the rudder wire and then made a new plug for it, so I don't have a bunch of extra wire hanging out for that rudder servo wire. Now moving on to installing the landing gear. The first thing you want to do is install the hardware onto the wheels to hold it to the landing gear. So you take this piece, and then this little metal cap right here just goes on there, and then you grab this little Allen screw. In the hardware bag, you'll see there's multiple different Allen screws. The one that goes on this part that holds the wheel on is the smaller one. So there's a small one that has a flat head, and then there's this one that has a rounder head. The flat one holds the wheel onto this little metal mount, and then the rounded head one is what mounts this part actually onto the carbon fiber gear. So I'm going to go ahead and take a 2mm Allen screwdriver and put a little bit of Loctite on there, and go ahead and put this together. Okay, so now that I have the wheels mounted into little mounting brackets, or little metal mounts for the wheels, I'm going to go ahead and mount these onto the carbon fiber gear. It's important to note that to know which way is forward on this gear. So there's 2 screw holes in the gear, and they're not centered, they're offset from the center, so the front of the gear will be the side that the holes are closest to. And you can see on, I look up here, you can see on here on the plane that the screws are more towards the front, so you know that the front of the carbon fiber, or you know which side is the front of the carbon fiber gear by looking at where the screw holes are. Okay, so what I like to do to put this gear on, go ahead and take my screw, put a little bit of Loctite on the tip of it, and then I'll put a little bit of Loctite on the end of it, and then run it through the gear and just get that screw started. I'm not going to screw it all the way down. Just get it started just to hold it on a little bit, and go ahead and do that. The other screw. Now that you've gotten them started, you can go ahead and get your wheel pant, slide it on there, and then go ahead and tighten those screws down. You don't want to over tighten these screws because you don't want to crack the wheel pant. I don't like putting glue on my wheel pants just because if I ever need to take the wheel pant off and clean it, if I get grass or mud or anything in there, and it fits very snugly without gluing it. So I've not found it necessary to put any glue or anything on the wheel pant. So I'm going to go ahead and just repeat that process on the other side. Alright, and this is what it should look like once you're done. The mount is on the inside of the wheel pant, and the wheel pant is squished between the carbon fiber and the mount for the wheel. Now, mounting the gear on the plane itself is super simple. It's just 2 screws that come already bolted on there. And it's just as simple as unscrewing those screws and then screwing the gear on. And now the last step for putting the gear on the front is to glue this little piece on here. This piece is just for cosmetic, just for looks. I'll just use a little bit of medium CA to glue this on. You can see it does come with cutouts so that the screws don't keep it from fitting flush. Another thing is, if you ever have to take the gear off in the future, just poke a little hole in the covering right where the screw holes are, and then you can get your screwdriver in there and unscrew it off. I'm not going to poke a hole in there now just because I'm hoping I don't ever have to take this gear off, and just in my opinion, looks better without a hole in there. But if you want to be able to take your gear off and you don't have to want to worry about having to poke a hole in the covering later on, you could go ahead and cut these little holes out of the covering right there before putting this on. Moving on to the tail wheel, just going to take a 1.5 millimeter Allen screwdriver and pop these screws out. I'm just going to grab my tail wheel assembly, making sure to slide this little push rod on the tail wheel, or whatever you want to call it. Slide it into the eyelet on the rudder that's pre-installed, line up the holes, hit the screws with a little bit of Loctite, put them back in, and you're good to go. It's not a bad idea if you don't have the servo hooked up on the rudder. Just move it back and forth after putting the tail wheel on, just to make sure nothing is binding on the tail wheel. And in this case, we're good to go. Okay, so I want to make sure to point out that if you see this little spot in the covering right there, there's a hole where, or there's supposed to be a hole there, but it's got covering over it. But that is supposed to be cut out so that there can be airflow coming in from the motor, coming in here, cooling everything off, and then the air hits this bulkhead right here, and then it's supposed to be able to go out the fuselage right there. But you have to cut that hole out. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the plane over. We're going to cut that out, and then we'll be pretty much done with this build. So it's important that when you do this, you make sure you're cutting in the right section. So on this plane, the section that you want to cut out, let me tilt the camera down just a little bit. If you see this little hole right here where the wing alignment pins go, if you go right up from that hole, then this section right here, that is where you're going to be cutting. But then another way to make sure you're in the right spot, if you kind of push the covering in a little bit, you can see that there is a rounded edge on the wood underneath this spot, and that lets you know that you're also looking in the right spot, because the other edges, like if you look back here, this edge is just a hard right angle, but this edge down in here, there's a nice curve cut in the wood right there. Then also look from the fuselage, look from the top down to also verify you're cutting in the right spot. So to start, I'm just going to take a knife. I'm just going to go ahead and get started with the knife. Make sure that you, when you're doing this, you don't have any wires or anything on the other side. So now that I've kind of got it going and made sure I'm in the right spot. So I almost forgot, before I cut this out, I like to hit the covering around where I'm going to be cutting with an iron, just to make sure that I have all of the covering nice and sealed around where I'm cutting, so that the covering doesn't try to peel up at all while I'm cutting. So I'm waiting on my iron to go ahead and heat up, and once it's heated up, let me see, I've got it set to 220. So once my iron hits 220 degrees, I'm going to go ahead and go back over covering in that spot, make sure that it's sealed down, the adhesive is been able to stick down real good before I start cutting. Alright, so I'm just going to get a knife, start cutting out this hole. Want to make sure you have a pretty sharp knife. Just take your time following around the cutout. Now that I've got the hole cut out, I'm just going to go back over the edges one more time with the iron. Make sure I seal everything down real good. I'm going to go ahead and walk through how to set up the pull system for the rudder. So first you want to get your little linkages. I'm going to go ahead and screw the ball joint on there. Don't have to get it all the way. I wouldn't crank it all the way down because you want to have room in your threads if you need to tighten it up later. But I also don't want to get it so loose on there that if I get this cable set up and it's already tight and this was not screwed down as much as it needed to be, that I'm going to over tighten the cable if I have to tighten this down more. So I'd go like maybe about that far, like about halfway. And then I've already taped, or you see where I had this cable taped on here. Go ahead and untape that. Not going to pull it out too far just because I want to make sure I don't lose it on the other side. It's in the fuselage. Give myself a little bit of slack here. Alright, so the first thing you want to do, get this little metal tube, or not exactly sure what this is called. Go ahead and slide it onto your cable. Take your linkage piece, your little adapter, slide it on. Take your cable, go ahead and slide it through just like that. Want to make sure to give yourself plenty of extra because you're going to go back around. I'm checking up here where the servo is to make sure I don't run out of cable up here either. Looks like I'm okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and go back through. Like that, and pull that tight. I'm just holding on to the ball link and I'm going to grab this end. I don't want this little metal tube to get too far away from the ball link. I don't want to have a huge loop in the wire. I'm just kind of working it, taking my time, get it where I want it. I'm going to kind of push down on this loop in the cable here to get it seated in. There you go. Zoom in a little here. Alright, hopefully you can kind of see that better now that I'm zoomed in. Yep, I have not crimped this down at all. Got it real nice and tight. Now that it's good and tight, I'm just going to take these pliers, crimp it down. You can use some vice grips to kind of help crimp this down, but I would just be careful that you don't crimp it too hard because you don't want to mess up the cable underneath and crush the cable to the point where the cable is splitting or breaking off in there. Yep, now that that's done, just go ahead and cut this excess wire, making sure to leave a little bit. I could probably about right there. Then I'm going to take some pliers and just kind of push this down. And there you go. Now that I've got this this ball link on, I'm going to go ahead and mount it into the rudder control horn, and then repeat on the other side. Alright, so I went ahead and I got both sides of the pull system for the rudder hooked up on the rudder. it's time to move on to hooking things into the servo. This is where it gets a little bit more challenging because you got to make sure you get the tension in both of the cables correct. It's also very important that you don't have the cables twisted up around each other coming through the fuselage. So as you can see, coming here straight from the rudder, no, they're not twisted up or anything like that. So now I would go ahead and cross them. You do want to run them crossed but not twisted up. So I got them crossed like that. And now I'm going to go ahead and hook them into my pull servo arm. So for starters, I would go ahead and take some masking tape. Go ahead and tape your rudder so that it's not going to move around while you're doing this. Go ahead and tape it right here on the counterbalance to make sure it stays centered while you're doing this. So the process of hooking up the pull cable on the servo is exactly the same as it was on the rudder, with the difference being that this time you have to worry about the exact placement of the ball link on the cable to make sure that the cable is tight. You do have the ability to adjust a little bit with the screws on here, so if it's a little too tight you can loosen these, and if it's a little too loose you can tighten them, but you don't want to rely too much on that because there's only so much play in that. So once again, I would go ahead and put your adapter piece on your ball link about halfway, because we're going to go ahead and try to get this snug now. So we don't want to have a whole lot of way to go if we need to loosen this. We don't want it to get loosened so much that the ball link falls off. And if we want to tighten it, we want to have space left to tighten it. So I'm going to go ahead and once again get my little metal crimp piece and slide it on there. It's important to make sure one last time before you do this, you look down through the fuselage and just make sure that you only have the cables crossed one time and that they aren't bound up on anything in the fuselage. Sometimes the cables like to get bound up on the grooves in the fuselage for the servo wires. So you want to just look through there and make sure that's not happening. Right. Go ahead and thread this on. Loop it around. Back through. Now I'm just going to start kind of adjusting this to where it's close to the right spot. Hindsight, it definitely would have been easier to do this on the rudder instead of dealing with trying to do this in the fuselage. So I'd recommend that when you do this, you hook it onto the servo first and then go back and do it on the rudder. I do all this tightening on the rudder. Okay, so I've got the cable basically exactly where I want it to be. So what I like to do is just get some pliers and gently crimp down the cable itself, just to kind of crease it right there so that kind of know where my spot is, so that while I'm tightening everything down, don't lose the spot in the cable where I want the this linkage to sit. We'll note too that I'm putting the ball link on the middle hole on this servo arm. All right, I like this where it's at. Go ahead and crimp this down. Okay, so now I'm going to repeat the same process on this side and I will be done. Since I already walked through how to do the pushrod setup for the elevator, I'm not going to walk through every single aspect of the aileron pushrod setup because it's basically the same. But I did want to just take a quick video of how it should look after you got it set up. Yeah, this is how your aileron pushrod should look after you have it set up. As far as the servo setup, a lot of that has to do with preference, but I will go ahead and say how I have mine set up. So first of all, when you set up your servos, you want to make sure that you adjust the sub trim to make sure that all of the surfaces are perfectly centered when the trim on your transmitter is centered. So as you can see, I've made sure that my elevator is perfectly centered and my ailerons are as well. And then the way I have mine set up, this is just the setup I fly with. I use one rate and I have my aileron set to 38 degrees up, 36 degrees down. My elevator is maxed out and my rudder is almost maxed out. So I'll show you what that looks like. So full up elevator completely closes the gap, and then full down elevator. Let me show you underneath here. Full down elevator is going to look like that. I want to just barely have that control horn touching the elevator. I don't want it binding up on the elevator, so I just have it barely tapping it. And then for rudder throw, I don't want any binding with the elevator, so I just have it going almost to where it's touching, about the same space on both sides. Now I'll go back and forth just to make sure that when it slams to full throw that it's not going to tap the elevator at all. You can see how much throw that is on the servo in there. And then as far as expo go, that also has to do a lot with preference, but I typically run, or I would recommend a starting point being 50% expo on all surfaces if you're just trying to figure out where you want your expo to be. I like to run a little bit more on my ailerons and a little bit less on my rudder, and then right out about 50 on my elevator. That's how I typically have my plane set up, but that's personal preference. Also, you could run a low rate or mid rate as well, where you just back off the rates a little bit if you want to have a more like precision rate. I just fly in the same rate all the time. That's just my preference, but it's totally up to you how you want to have that set up. For figuring out the CG, I would start with setting it up right where the recommended CG is. There's a little mark right here where the recommended CG is, and it's right on the wing tube pretty much. So that, where I have the battery right now, that's about where the recommended CG is, well, I'm sorry, the battery placement to get the recommended CG would be. So I'm going to go ahead and start with putting the battery there, and then I will fly it and adjust from there if I feel like after flying it that the CG needs to move at all. So I don't use the battery strap that came with the kit just because the battery strap that came with it is not great. So I just went and bought this cheap battery strap off of Amazon. I'm going to end up using that. Feeding this battery strap through can definitely be a little bit tricky. Sometimes you just got to have some patience and work with it. What I found works pretty well. You can thread it through this first little slot and then get it through this bigger hole. That's kind of a good way to start with and then go from there. I'll kind of bend it over to try to get it to make it easier to slide in there. Alright, so this is what I was saying. I got it through the bigger hole, and now sometimes once you get it through this bigger hole, you can kind of stick your finger in here and work it into the smaller hole. Or just drop it back in there accidentally like I just did. Alright, there you go. Battery strap is on. I'm going to just go ahead and test fit the battery. There you go. As a very final step, I like to take a microfiber towel and this spray wax, this quick wax stuff, just kind of spray it on the plane just to help protect the Ultracoat and keep it looking really good. I wanted to go over the wire management that I ended up with in the plane, so you can kind of see how I've got the wires going through the wire holder, running all the way back through the tail for the elevator, and then I've got two Aileron wires coming in with the little short custom extensions I made. The rudder wire, I made a custom extension to make it real short so that there's not a lot of extra wire there. Got the glitch protector capacitor that's just going into the battery port of my receiver, and then I have the two plugs coming, or the two wires coming off of the ESC. One is going into the throttle channel, and then the other is just going into a spare channel as kind of a redundant power source for the ESC. And that's it. All right, everybody. Well, that's going to wrap up the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if you have any suggestions for the experiences you've had in building planes, please put those in the comments, as well as if you have any questions for me, I will do my best to answer them. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you on the next one. Happy flying. Bye.